This week on Ramen School, we are doing toppings. And the two most popular ramen toppings are the ones that you can see when the bowl first hits the table in front of you: chashu and ajitama. And today I'm going to show you 3 different ways of making chashu. Chashu is the pork that sits on top of ramen. It's sort of the Japanese interpretation of the word for barbecue in Chinese. It's very different, of course, because it's not barbecued. It's not that Hong Kong style of barbecue. It is a simmered dish of very, very soft braised pork that is sometimes grilled just to finish it. The thing you need to know about ramen is that even though some people may say it has thousands of years of history, China and Japan, but certainly hundreds of years in Japan itself, it is a really modern dish. The current focus and movement in ramen is around what's called kodawari. It means artisan, essentially, in Japanese. So ramen went from being this very, very street-style dish, eaten and served usually on the streets after the Second World War, to something that is really, really turned into a high-end interpretation. There are ramen places in Tokyo that have Michelin stars, and people are putting a lot more focus on the ingredients and the method that go into making different bowls of ramen. What that means is that obviously the style changes a lot. If you ate ramen in Japan 20, 25 years ago, it was all about tonkotsu, really, really strongly thick, fragrant pork bone broth. These days in Tokyo, there's a real boom more around things like shio ramen, lighter versions of shoyu, tori paitan, different varieties rather than just thick and heavy tonkotsu that was popular quite a few years ago. Also, that means that the style of chashu has changed. You know, the traditional style of just having that rolled couple of slices of pork sitting on top of your ramen is still very popular, but there are a lot of ramen places that are doing it much, much more differently. And I'm gonna show you a few different ways that it's being done now. So the 3 different types of chashu I'm gonna show you is the traditional kind of rolled pork belly. We're gonna do an unrolled pork belly as well, and then we're also gonna do pork neck. There are many, many different ways of making chashu in Japan these days. You know, some people use shoulder, some people use different cuts of pork altogether. But let's start from the top. Simple rolled chashu, here we go. This is a piece of pork belly. It comes from an entire side of a pig, so it's usually probably about that long. And you can see that the grain of the meat actually tends to run along the length of the pig, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And so you want to be able to roll the pork belly so that the grain is running along the length of the roll. Some people, if they're making a really big long one in a ramen shop, they'll roll the entire pork belly over. We're not going to do that here, obviously, because we can't fit it on the stove. But you don't want to roll the whole thing like this, because then you're going to get a huge piece of rolled pork, more like Italian porchetta. But what we're going to do is cut it in half and then roll this thick side. What you'll notice is that there's no skin on the pork belly. Chashu very rarely has skin on it. Sometimes it does these days, you know, anything goes, but historically it doesn't. So get your butcher to take the skin off, or just use a sharp knife. So I'm just gonna cut this in half so I get a nice appropriately sized roll. You can see here, it's different parts of the pig, obviously. So there's a thick end and then a thin end there. You want this nice fat cap to be sitting on the outside. So we'll start from this thin end and just roll it into a cylinder. In order to secure this, you kind of want to make sure everything's kind of tucked in nicely. Classic shoelace tie. When you cross it over, instead of going over once, go over twice. The additional friction that you get from rolling that over twice is actually enough to hold the string together while you do your second knot. Otherwise it just keeps falling open. And the second knot there to form it into a dead knot. And leave this little end on there as well, because that's what we're going to use to secure it. So rather than going sort of one side to the other side as you would in normal kind of French butchery, you want to take this and go right to the other end first. So come along the length first and then come around the other end here. Go underneath and then just slowly work your way around again, again, and again. And then when you get back to where you started, again, just a very simple knot to finish it off. Trim the end of that, and that's our simple rolled pork belly for chashu. So I'll drop that into a pot. Now, the other 2 types of chashu I want to show you, they've really nothing to do at all. I mean, you can actually tie up some of this pork neck as well. I'm not going to, I'm just going to leave it open just so you see the different shapes that you can get. And essentially the reason people do it differently is not just to be a bit different, because you get different expressions, obviously. A piece of rolled pork belly like this is obviously going to taste a fair bit different to a piece like this that's been left whole. But preparation is just the same. So I'm just going to throw the pork dick in just as it is. And if you go to a lot of different ramen shops, you'll tend to see that many places are using completely different cuts of pork. This traditional style of rolled chashu is starting to become a lot less popular in Japan. I need to take some of the protein and scum and blood out of that, so cover it with cold water and bring that to a boil. Once the pork's been boiling for about 20 minutes, we remove it from the heat, cold water over the top, and brush away any scum that's clinging to the side of the pork. We need to wash the pot as well, and then return the pork back in the clean pot and cover it with cold water. So the pork's finished its first boil and it's now been covered with cold water. It's time to start building layers of flavor on top of that. One of the big differences between, I guess, a Japanese braised chashu and a Chinese braised pork belly is that the seasonings are added in a different order. There's an old Japanese mnemonic that is Sashisu Seso, which is the S letters of the Japanese alphabet. What it stands for is sato, sugar, shio, salt, su, vinegar, se is shoyu, so soy sauce, and miso. And that gives you the order in which you add those basic seasonings of Japanese cooking. So we're gonna add into this, in order, our sugar, sato, our shio, and then our soy sauces towards the end. So this will actually cook for quite a while with just basic seasonings before we add the soy sauce later, because you don't want the soy sauce to overpower the flavor of the pork here. So we're gonna cook this first with a couple of umami seasonings. So into the cold water, some kombu and our dried shiitake mushrooms. I'll put that into the heat and bring that slowly over about medium heat up to a simmer, removing the kombu when it starts to steam and the kombu gets soft. So the water's warm now and just starting to steam, and you can see that the kombu is softened. It's starting to get a little bit slimy and gelatinous. Our thumbprint is leaving an indentation in the kombu, so it's time to take the kombu out. And we'll bring that up to a low simmer. At a low simmer, we can add in our first two seasonings, so the sugar and the salt, the sa and shi. And then I'm going to cover it with a drop lid. A drop lid's a really important tool in Japanese cooking because it keeps the ingredients submerged under the lid. It actually sits directly on the ingredients and it allows them to braise evenly. Now this needs to simmer for about an hour before we add in our other seasonings. That's looking pretty good now. So in with our sake and some mirin as well. Soy sauce, two different kinds, dark soy sauce and light soy sauce. Let that braise for another hour and the pork should be tender. Now I'll just let that cool in the liquid and then I'll carefully remove the pork to a tray and put that in the fridge to chill completely. The braising liquid I'll just strain and put in the fridge as well. So when the chashu comes out of the fridge, it looks a bit like this. It's really important not to skip the refrigeration step because no matter how sharp your knife is, it can be very easy to, I guess, mash up chashu like this. You want a nice clean slice, particularly for sitting on top of ramen. So let's cut it and see how we went. Firstly, for our rolled chashu, I'll just take the string off first. And this has been braised for a long time, so you do want to be careful doing this. You know, it is going to be quite delicate. And this is also why it's better to tie the pork up in this Japanese style rather than in the French style. It's just a little bit easier to unwrap because I guess the European style of trussing is for meats that are going to be roasted or something, and it's not that difficult to unwrap. But when it's this tender, you do need to be quite delicate with it. There's our chashu. I'll just take a clean slice first. Now these end bits, if you go to a ramen restaurant, you'll probably see chashu rice or something served there, or maybe a different type of ramen where this is chopped up, where the presentation doesn't matter quite so much, but that's what those pieces are used for. It's up to you how thickly you want to slice it. It depends on how you're going to reheat it. Let's go through a couple of options for reheating in a second, but for now, about 1/2 centimeter. Now this is our unrolled chashu, and again, I'll take the end piece off. This one I might cut just a little bit more thickly, about 3/4 of a centimetre there. And now this is our pork neck. Now we're not too worried about this being even. The reason we're using pork neck is because we want something a little bit uneven, but still take off the end part. And this one I'll cut quite thinly, maybe slightly less than 1/2 centimetre. Now let's talk reheating. We've got a few options here. You can use one of these. Now this is a grill that you might get in Japan. You put it over a normal gas flame, you can grill over it. You can use a barbecue, you can put that into an oven and heat it through in an oven. You can fry this whole thing in a frying pan to caramelize the outside. I don't particularly like to do that because it's much more difficult to cut. Or you can use a blowtorch like this. No matter how you want to do it, it's very, very simple. A lot of ramen places don't even bother to reheat. Some of the cheaper places, will just slice a very, very thin piece of chashu like this and put it on top of the soup and let it warm through in the soup. Totally reasonable to do it that way. But here are our 3 forms of chashu for ramen.